What's up, everyone? I'm Margot Sapel from MovieMaker magazine, and I'm about to chat with Joe Berlinger, the director of Conversations with the Killer, the Jeffrey Dahmer Tapes. It's out today on Netflix, and Joe and I are about to talk about glimpsing humanity in a serial killer, the circumstances of Dahmer's death in prison in 1994, and how Berlinger always knew that his Conversations with the Killer series would be a trilogy comprised of Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and Jeffrey Dahmer. And now, here's Joe Berlinger.
I see it as a trilogy, I'm fascinated by these three serial killers in particular. And whether or not there's another one in another conversations, who knows? But for me, the plan was always to do these three because I think they're particularly fascinating because they all present themselves as quite normal people. Bundy had lots of friends and a live-in girlfriend who thought he was incredible, which of course was the subject of my Zac Efron, Lily Collins movie, Extremely Wicked, and also Conversation with the Killer. Gacy was favorite guy in the neighborhood, threw big parties, the, local Democratic precinct captain, rubbed shoulders with Rosalind Carter. Dahmer, more of a loner, but very mild-mannered, and you wouldn't imagine in a million years he was a serial killer. So these three in particular, I wanted to focus on because that era was an era of, homophobia, which affected both the Gacy and Dahmer cases. It was an era of before DNA, so the police did a terrible job solving these cases. And the prevailing attitudes of the day of, racial and attitudes towards, gay people, really sealed the fate of these victims. And so, to me, I look at all three of these as kind of a trilogy.
Yeah, I think they are. What do you think sets Jeffrey Dahmer apart from other serial killers, or maybe what does he have in common?
Dahmer for me is the most fascinating because he showed glimpses of remorse, and I know that's controversial and there'll be a lot of psychiatrists or psychologists or whatever who tell me, I'm wrong. He even had glimpses of empathy at times, things like, he put his victims to sleep with a pill before he killed them. Gacy loved the kill, loved the torture. Bundy loved the kill. Not got something literally out of the kill. Dahmer did not. Dahmer, it's a perverse way of thinking, obviously, and I'm not condoning the horror that he inflicted on his victims, but this idea that he wanted to control people because he didn't want them to leave. He wanted companionship. I mean, that is a very different impulse than most other serial killers. He was very candid about what he did. These tapes are a remarkable reveal of his mindset. The amazing thing about these tapes and why I wanted to do this series in this way is that Wendy Patricus, who's the unsung hero of, I think, the Dahmer case, we've never heard Wendy before. And yet she's the one who gleaned most of the really revelatory information for the police in these conversations. And here's a guy, Dahmer, who actually wanted to help solve the crimes, not the crimes, the identification of the victims. That's super unusual for a serial killer to willingly work with the police. And, Richard Cottingham, it took him 3 decades to give information to the police. And I believe he did that only because, he wanted a benefit. So Richard Cottingham was the serial killer we profiled in my other Netflix series called Crime Scene. That's why I'm invoking his name. But Dahmer is an amazingly complex character who did some of the worst things to a victim that a serial killer can do. And yet there is a slight opening of humanity that you see in him. So it's just an utter source of fascination for me.
Yeah, I was going to ask you because he is such a complex character, like Wendy pointed out in the series, But how did you walk the line of showing his human side, but like not overshadowing obviously the evil that he did? Like, were you aware of like not wanting it to get too sympathetic to him, or was that not on your mind?
No, it was very much on my mind, but what's always on my mind is truthfulness and accuracy. And Wendy, for example, there's a moment in the show that I'm curious how people are going to react to, where Wendy, talks about how she felt like she was, like a mother figure, a friend, psychiatrist, and she clearly sees the humanity in him. Doesn't, like me, condone or or justify the horrible behavior, but I think seeing him as a three-dimensional human being, the way Wendy did, was the key to unlocking the revelations that he gave her. And those revelations allowed the police to, solve the identification puzzle, because sadly, if people don't know the story, I mean, he literally cut up his victims and disposed of body parts. And so fragments of bodies were left. And so how do you take those fragments of bodies and figure out who this person is? And it was only through the help of Dahmer and the information he gave that allowed the police to make those identification of his 17 victims. And I think because Wendy saw him as a three-dimensional human being and interacted with him in that way, it allowed information to come out, in a way that I don't think we've seen with other serial killers.
Yeah, and I also know in the past when we've spoken about your other series, you're very conscious about wanting the voices of the victims to be heard. And I'm wondering, what was the process like of reaching out to people who knew Dahmer's victims and even people who knew Dahmer, like his roommate, or his across the hall neighbor from the
Yeah.
apartment? How easy or difficult was it to get other voices to speak, especially who knew the victims?
Yeah, we got a couple of people who haven't spoken before, like his childhood friend, and one of the guys who was a friend of a victim. Um, so I thought that was good. I will be honest and say we reached out to multiple family members of all the victims, and for the most part, nobody wanted to participate, or didn't respond to us. So that was disappointing, because I would have liked to have their voices in. I think in the Gacy tapes we have, in some ways, greater victim representation, and you can only tell the victim story if people talk to you. And to me, it's very important to you know make the victims three-dimensional human beings, and we do the best we can with the limited resources we had. But we did reach out to everybody.
In the last episode, when you cover how Dahmer died, do you think that he knew that was going to happen? I mean, obviously, Wendy said you shouldn't do this. Do you think that he wanted to die when he went into the general population of the prison, or do you think it was more of like a risk he was willing to take to just not have to be in solitary confinement?
Great question. Of course, we'll never know the truth, and this is just me speculating. But again, the reason I find Dahmer so fascinating is that we see glimpses of humanity. And again, I know when I say that, some people are going to like go through the roof. What are you talking about? But he is a human being, and we see glimpses of humanity that makes him different than other serial killers, and perhaps provides a clue as to how we can solve the riddle of why certain, and it's usually men, and it's usually white men, but not always, why people go down this path. Because only by understanding how the brain functions and understanding how empathy works can we ever solve the riddle of why people do these things, to, why this is part of the human condition. But there are glimpses of humanity of him that you don't see with other serial killers. And I do think he purposely put himself in a situation where he knew he would be taken out, because he didn't have the courage to do it himself. He didn't have the willpower or strength. And I think he out of guilt, I do think he purposely set himself up to be killed.
But I also thought that Wendy made a good point when she said it was kind of a tragedy because they could have maybe learned more about him, like you're saying. Do you think that, do you think there it's even possible to get to the bottom of like why he did that? Like, do you think any amount of like brain scans or like scientific research on him could have like come up with an answer to that?
Um, I mean, Dorothy Lewis, which is who was the subject of a Alex Gibney documentary, Crazy Not Insane. Tries to delve into that. I think it's unanswerable, but people need to continue to dig in and try to understand what makes somebody lack empathy enough to do these terrible things. But the other reason to do the show and why I feel it's important to put these shows out is that you want to send the warning signs out for people. You want people to be able to recognize somebody who's in need. For example, Dahmer at an early age had an obsession with dead animals. So, like, if somebody watches the show, my show, and there's somebody they know that has an obsession with dead animals the way Dahmer did, maybe that person will keep an extra eye out. I'm not saying that everyone who has an obsession with dead animals is a serial killer, but it is a warning sign, for example. So you have to, there was 9 years between his first and second killings. There was a 9-year gap where he tried to control himself, where he was sleeping with mannequins instead of real people to see if that would provide him with the companionship that he was looking for, that he was craving. But ultimately he lost the battle and then went on a killing spree. During that 9-year period, if somebody had recognized some of the warning signs, maybe it would have had a different outcome. So I think retelling these stories for a new generation is critically important to try to identify people who might be leaning towards that. I think it's incredibly important to remind law enforcement that when you view things with a homophobic and racial lens and you treat marginalized communities with disregard, that terrible things can happen. So there's all sorts of reasons to tell these stories. Um, and one of them is to like try to understand that riddle of the brain and to see what the warning signs are.